A billionaire father finds a poor little girl sleeping on a bench on Christmas Eve and asks, "Can I be your father on this special night?" What happened next is incredible. Snowflakes fell gently on the city as Victor Caldwell turned the key in his apartment lock. The silence greeted him like an old and unwelcome friend. December 24th, Christmas Eve, and the only sound was the heater struggling against a cold that seemed to come as much from outside as from within him. Victor tossed his keys onto the coffee table and hung his heavy coat on the rack. His footsteps echoed on the hardwood floor as he walked to the kitchen, where he opened the refrigerator, only to find some leftovers and a half-empty bottle of wine. Christmas. The word sounded like a joke now. In the hallway, his gaze stopped on the framed photograph of Claire, 5 years old, brown hair, and a smile missing 2 baby teeth, his daughter. His little princess who now lived on the other side of the city with her mother, after the divorce that had split his world in half. "Merry Christmas, Claire," he murmured, lightly touching the frame. The last call had been 3 weeks ago, brief, as always. His ex-wife's voice in the background, rushing the conversation. "Daddy has to go now, sweetie." But he wasn't the one who wanted to end the call. He never was. Victor turned away from the photograph, feeling that familiar emptiness grow in his chest. The house, decorated with a small tree he had bought more out of obligation than Christmas spirit, seemed to mock his loneliness. He couldn't spend the night there, not today. He grabbed his coat again and went out into the street. The biting cold was almost welcome, at least it was a real sensation. He walked aimlessly, passing families carrying shopping bags, couples holding hands, and excited children pointing at the decorations in the shop windows. Every smile he saw seemed to accentuate his own lack of one. The streets grew emptier as he moved away from the commercial district. The snow now covered his shoulders and hair, but Victor barely noticed. His thoughts were far away, lost in memories of Christmases past, when there was still laughter in his home. That's when he reached a small square, lit only by a few old lampposts and the colorful lights of a pine tree decorated by the city. The place was deserted, except for a small figure lying on one of the benches. Victor stopped. He blinked a few times to make sure of what he was seeing. A child. She couldn't have been more than 5 years old, curled up under a coat too thin for the temperature, sleeping while hugging a worn-out rag doll. Victor's heart skipped a beat. He approached slowly, so as not to startle her. The girl was visibly shivering, even in her sleep. Her small face was red from the cold, and snowflakes were collecting in her messy blonde hair. "Oh my God," he whispered, kneeling in the snow. He lightly touched the child's shoulder. "Hey, little one?" The girl slowly opened her eyes, blue eyes, frightened at first, then wary. She hugged the doll tighter. "Don't be afraid," Victor said softly. "It's too cold to be out here. Where are your parents?" The girl sat up on the bench, still clutching the doll. She looked around as if searching for someone, then looked back at Victor with a sadness that seemed too big for someone so small. "What's your name?" he asked, keeping enough distance not to intimidate her. She hesitated, as if deciding whether she could trust him. The wind blew harder, making her shiver again. "My name is Sophie," she finally answered, in a voice as small as she was. "Sophie," Victor repeated, smiling gently. "I'm Victor. What are you doing out here all alone on Christmas Eve?" She pressed her lips together, fighting back the tears that were beginning to form. "I have nowhere to go," she said simply, her eyes fixed on the doll in her lap. Victor felt as if something heavy had landed on his chest. He looked around, searching for any sign of an adult who might be with her. There was no one. "Are you hungry?" he asked, already knowing the answer. Sophie nodded timidly. "I have food at my place," he said, "and it's warm there." Her eyes widened with a mix of hope and distrust. "My daddy told me not to go with strangers," she murmured, hugging the doll tighter. Victor nodded, respecting that important rule. "Your daddy was right," he agreed. "That's a very important rule." He was silent for a moment, thinking. He couldn't just leave her there, but he didn't want to scare her either. Then he had an idea. "What if I call the police? They can take you to a safe place." Panic crossed the little girl's face. "No, please," she exclaimed. "They'll take me away." Victor understood. A lump formed in his throat, The snow began to fall more heavily. Sophie shivered violently, and Victor realized he didn't have time for deliberations. This child needed help now. "Sophie," he said softly, "I have a daughter your age. Her name is Claire. She doesn't live with me right now, but I have a warm room and food." He took his wallet out of his pocket and showed her the photograph of Claire he always carried with him. "See, this is my daughter. I would never harm a child." Sophie looked at the photo, then at Victor, assessing him with a seriousness that was impressive for someone so young. "I promise that tomorrow we can look for proper help for you," he continued. "But tonight is Christmas." Something moved inside him, an emotion he hadn't felt in a long time, a need to protect, to care. "Sophie," the words came out almost as a whisper, "can I be your father on this special night?" Her blue eyes filled with tears. For a terrible moment, Victor thought he had said something wrong, that he had scared her. But then, slowly, a small hand reached out towards him. Sophie took Victor's hand, her tiny, cold fingers fitting into his. She didn't say anything, but that gesture was answer enough. Carefully, Victor took off his own coat and wrapped it around the girl, lifting her into his arms. Sophie was too light, he noted with concern. The rag doll was held firmly between them. "Let's go home," he said, feeling a strange certainty in those words. The walk back felt different. The same Christmas lights that had previously seemed to mock his loneliness now shone like guides, lighting the way through the falling snow. Sophie remained quiet in his arms, observing everything with watchful eyes, as if memorizing the route. When they reached the building, the doorman looked on with curiosity, but Victor just nodded, saying everything was fine. In the elevator, Sophie finally spoke again. "Is your house pretty?" she asked in a low voice. Victor smiled. "It's nothing special, but it's warm and safe." When he opened the apartment door, he gently placed Sophie on the floor. She took 2 steps inside and stopped, as if she didn't know what to do next. Her eyes scanned the room, observing every detail. The small Christmas tree in the corner, the simple but comfortable furniture, the photographs on the walls. "You can come in," Victor encouraged. "It's okay." Sophie moved forward with cautious steps, still clutching her doll. She stopped in front of the Christmas tree, looking at it with fascination. "It's beautiful," she whispered. Victor felt a pang in his chest. A simple tree with few ornaments that to him seemed so sad was a source of wonder for her. "I'll get you something to eat," he said, heading to the kitchen. "You can sit on the couch if you want." While heating up some soup he had in the fridge, Victor peeked at Sophie from the kitchen. She was now carefully exploring the living room, touching objects with her fingertips as if afraid of breaking them. She stopped in front of the photograph of Claire on the shelf. "Is that your daughter?" she asked, when she noticed Victor watching her. "Yes," he replied. "Claire. She's 5. "I'm 5 too," Sophie said, and for the first time, a small smile appeared on her face. Victor served the soup in a bowl and placed some cookies on a plate. He improvised a tray and brought it to the living room, where Sophie had already sat on the edge of the sofa, as if afraid to take up too much space. "Here you go," he said, placing the tray on the coffee table. "Be careful, it's hot." Sophie looked at the food as if it were a treasure. She waited for Victor to nod before she began to eat, slowly at first, then more eagerly. While she ate, Victor went to the closet and got a soft blanket. He returned and placed it next to Sophie. "To keep you warm," he explained. "So thank you," she said in a low voice, without taking her eyes off the food. Victor sat in the armchair opposite her, watching her. There were so many questions he wanted to ask, so many things he needed to understand, but he knew it wasn't the right time. Sophie needed to feel safe first. When she finished eating, she seemed more relaxed, though still watchful. "Sophie," Victor began carefully, "you can stay here tonight. Tomorrow we'll find some help for you, okay?" Fear returned to her eyes. "What kind of help?" "People who can take care of you, give you a home, food, and education." Sophie looked down at the doll in her lap. "Will they separate me from Lily?" she asked, referring to the toy. "I know," Victor assured her, feeling a pain in his chest. "I'm sure they won't." She nodded slowly, but Victor could see she wasn't convinced. "You can keep the blanket," he continued. and sleep here on the sofa. It's pretty comfortable." "Can I really stay?" she asked, almost in disbelief. "Of course you can. Just for tonight, for now." Sophie took the blanket and pulled it up to her chin. It was too big for her, wrapping her up completely. "Thank you," she said again, and there was a gratitude in her voice that made Victor look away, moved. "You're welcome," he replied simply. "Get some rest. I'm right there in the other room if you need anything." Victor got up and went to his room, leaving the door ajar. He lay on the bed, fully dressed, and stared at the ceiling. What was he doing? Tomorrow he would have to take her to some authority. She would need to go to a shelter or into the foster system. He felt a pang of guilt for not calling the police immediately, but he couldn't bring himself to regret it. The thought of Sophie spending Christmas Eve in a police station was unbearable. After almost an hour, he got up silently to check on her. He stood at the living room doorway watching the sofa. Sophie had fallen asleep, still clutching her doll. Her face was softened by sleep, her breathing deep and regular. The blanket covered her completely, leaving only her face and a few strands of blonde hair visible. It was in that moment, watching the small figure asleep on his sofa, that Victor felt something break inside him. An inexplicable certainty took hold of his heart. He didn't want her to leave. It was an absurd, irrational idea. He had known this child for only a few hours. He knew nothing about being a father to a girl who had lost everything. But as he watched Sophie sleeping peacefully, perhaps for the first time in days, Victor knew. He wasn't alone anymore, and somehow he would make sure Sophie would never be alone again either. Victor woke to the sound of light footsteps around the house. For a moment he was confused, until the memories of the previous night came rushing back. He looked at the clock, 6:30 a.m. He got up quickly and put on a robe over his pajamas. He found Sophie sitting on the sofa, already dressed, hugging her rag doll. She looked up as he entered the room. "Good morning," Victor said, trying to sound casual, as if having a child in the house was a normal thing for him. "Did you sleep well?" Sophie nodded, but said nothing. Her eyes scanned the room, as if reconfirming where she was. "Want some breakfast?" he asked. "I can make eggs, or maybe... Do you like pancakes?" "Pancakes," she replied softly, and Victor felt a small victory for getting more than a nod. In the kitchen, Victor started preparing the batter. The simple routine of measuring ingredients and mixing them helped to organize his thoughts. What should he do now? Call the police or social services? It was the right thing to do. He knew that. But the thought of handing Sophie over to strangers, watching her enter the foster system or go to a shelter, caused a tightness in his chest. "Can I help?" The small voice startled him. Sophie was standing at the kitchen entrance, the rag doll held firmly in one hand. "Of course," Victor replied, surprised. "You can sit here on this chair and help me stir the batter. What do you think?" He pulled a chair up to the counter and placed the bowl with the pancake batter in front of her, handing her a wooden spoon. Sophie climbed onto the chair and began to stir carefully. "Do you like to cook?" Victor asked, trying to start a conversation. "Sometimes I helped my dad," she replied without looking up. "Same when we had food to make." Victor felt his heart ache. He turned to get milk from the refrigerator, hiding the expression on his face. "Do you know how to make hot chocolate?" he asked, trying to keep his voice light. Sophie looked at him, a small sparkle appearing in her eyes. "With marshmallows," Victor smiled. "Unfortunately, I don't have any marshmallows. But I have cinnamon. It's good too." As the pancakes cooked on the griddle, Victor prepared 2 mugs of hot chocolate. He remembered how Claire always asked him to blow on hers first, so she wouldn't burn her tongue. The thought of his daughter brought a pang of longing. He placed the pancakes on 2 plates and sat down at the table with Sophie. He watched her carefully pick up the fork and knife, cutting small pieces with adorable concentration. "Is it good?" he asked, after she had taken a few bites. Sophie nodded, picking up her mug of hot chocolate. She held it with both hands, blowing on the surface just as Victor had done when serving it. The steam rose, forming little clouds that she watched with fascination. Victor took advantage of the quiet moment to get a better look at her in the daylight. Her blonde hair was a bit tangled, and her clothes, though not torn, showed signs of prolonged use. The thin coat she had worn the night before was hanging on the chair next to her. It wasn't enough for the cold outside. "Sophie," he began carefully, "can you tell me a little more about how you were living before we met?" She lowered the mug, staring into the dark liquid. For a moment, Victor thought she wouldn't answer. But then, in a low, trembling voice, she began to speak. "After Daddy, after he didn't wake up anymore, I was scared, very scared." Victor nodded, giving her space to continue. "I was afraid to sleep on the street, that someone would take me, or that I wouldn't wake up." The simplicity of those words hid a universe of terror that no child should ever know. Victor felt a lump form in his throat. "How did you manage on your own?" he asked carefully. Sophie stirred her chocolate with a spoon, creating little brown whirlpools. "Daddy taught me how to hide," she explained. "He said that if anything happened to him, I should stay near the church because the people there are good, and he sewed a secret pocket in Lily." She held up the rag doll, showing a small, almost imperceptible opening in the back of the toy. "He kept money in here, for emergencies. I used it to buy bread and sometimes a hot chocolate at the diner near the square." Victor struggled to maintain his composure. A 5-year-old child, surviving alone on the streets of a big city, in the middle of winter, using money hidden in a doll. It was surreal, it was devastating. And nobody asked about you. Nobody tried to help. Sophie took another sip of chocolate before answering. "Daddy said not to trust anyone, that if I talked to strangers, they would take me far away, to a place where kids without parents go." "An orphanage," Victor said softly. "Yeah," Sophie agreed. "He said it's very sad there, that the kids cry at night. That I should stay hidden." Victor tried to imagine the desperation of that father, dying and knowing his little girl would be alone in the world. Perhaps the fear of losing her to the system had been greater than the fear of leaving her alone. It was an impossible choice. "Why did you talk to me yesterday?" he asked her, curious. "If your dad told you not to trust anyone." Sophie looked at him with those deep blue eyes, far too serious for such a small child. "I was very cold," she said simply. "And you showed me the picture of your daughter. Daddy said that people with kids are usually not bad." The childlike logic broke Victor's heart. He reached his hand across the table, not to touch her, but just to offer contact if she wanted it. "You did the right thing to trust me, Sophie. I promise I won't let anything bad happen to you." She didn't take his hand, but she nodded slightly. They finished breakfast in silence. Victor collected the plates and took them to the sink. His mind was racing, trying to decide what to do. The right thing would be to call social services. They would know how to proceed, find a family for Sophie, give her the proper care. But what if they didn't? What if she ended up in a place like the one her father feared, moving from foster home to foster home, never finding stability? "Dad, you have to send me away now?" The question was so quiet that Victor almost didn't hear it. He turned and saw Sophie still sitting at the table, looking at her own small hands, which were now clutching the doll tightly. "No," he replied quickly, surprising himself with the certainty in his voice. "No, Sophie, you're not leaving now." He walked to a cabinet in the living room and opened a drawer. From it, he took out a new notebook, still in its plastic wrapping, and a box of colored pencils he had bought for Claire the last time she was supposed to visit, a visit that ended up being cancelled. He returned to the table and placed the items in front of Sophie. "Yeah, you can stay here until I figure out what we're going to do," he said softly. "For now, how about you draw a little? Kids like to draw, right?" Sophie looked at the notebook and pencils as if they were treasures. She reached out her hand, touching the colorful cover of the notebook with her fingertips. "Can I really use them?" "Of course," Victor assured her. "They're yours now." Sophie gave a small, shy smile, the first one Victor had seen on her face. She opened the notebook carefully, as if afraid of breaking it, and chose a red pencil from the box. While she began to draw, Victor took the opportunity to wash the dishes and think. He needed new clothes for her, for sure, proper food for a child, maybe some toys, and he needed to find out what his legal options were. He couldn't just keep a child he found on the street, no matter how much his heart told him otherwise. When he finished in the kitchen, he returned to the living room, and found Sophie exploring the apartment with more courage. She stopped in front of the bookshelf where the family photographs were, studying each one intently. Victor watched her pick up a silver picture frame, which held a photo of Claire on her last birthday. In the picture, the girl was smiling broadly, holding a large teddy bear he had given her. "Who is this?" Sophie asked, turning to Victor with the picture frame in her hands. "That's Claire," he replied, approaching and sitting on the sofa. "By my daughter." Sophie looked from the photo to Victor, then back to the photo. "She looks happy," she commented. "She was," Victor confirmed. "It was her 5th birthday." "Where is she now?" Victor sighed, motioning for Sophie to sit next to him on the sofa. She came in, still holding the photograph. "Claire lives with her mom," he explained, "in another house. Her mom and I, we don't live together anymore." Sophie nodded, as if she perfectly understood the concept of divorce. "Does she come to visit you?" The innocent question hit Victor like an arrow. He felt that familiar pain tighten his chest. "Rarely," he admitted. "Her mother is always busy. And they live a bit far away." "Do you miss her?" Victor looked at this child he barely knew, who seemed to read right through him with disconcerting clarity. "Every day," he confessed. "Every minute of every day." Sophie handed the picture frame back to him, and he held it for a moment, running his thumb over his daughter's image. The longing he felt for Claire was a constant presence in his life, a pain he had learned to live with, but which never truly diminished. And now, looking at Sophie, at this child that fate had placed in his path, Victor felt a new fear arise. The fear of getting attached to her too, of forming another bond that could be broken. If he opened his heart to Sophie, if he let her fill a little of the void that Claire's absence had left, wasn't he just setting himself up for another loss? Because that's what would happen, wouldn't it? Sophie wasn't his daughter. At some point, the authorities would be notified. A family would be found for her, and Victor would be alone again in his silent apartment, with only photographs for company. "She looks like you," Sophie said, interrupting his thoughts. "You have the same smile." Victor looked at the photo again. He had never noticed that before. "How you think so?" he asked, genuinely surprised. Sophie nodded with conviction. "Yes, the eyes too, except hers are more cheerful." The observation, made with the brutal honesty that only children possess, made Victor laugh softly. "I think you're right," he agreed. "I haven't been smiling much lately." Sophie studied him intently, as if making some kind of important assessment. "You smiled when you gave me the notebook," she pointed out. Victor felt something warm spread through his chest, an almost forgotten sensation. "That's true," he admitted. "I did smile." A moment of comfortable silence settled between them. Victor placed the photograph back on the shelf and watched Sophie open the notebook again. She turned a page and showed him the drawing she had made. 2 stick figures, one large and one small, holding hands, with what looked like snowflakes falling around them. "That's us," she explained, "last night." Victor looked at the simple drawing and felt a lump form in his throat. In a few colored lines, Sophie had captured the moment that changed their lives. "It's beautiful," he said sincerely. "You draw very well." Sophie smiled again, still shyly, but with a bit more confidence. She turned the page and started another drawing, this time using a blue pencil. "What's it going to be now?" Victor asked, watching her. "So the sky," she answered simply. "The sky I used to see when I slept on the street. It has a lot of stars, you know, more than we can imagine." He nodded, imagining that small child alone, looking up at the stars while everyone around slept in warm houses. "Sophie," he began hesitantly, "you said your dad, that he didn't wake up anymore. How long ago was that?" She stopped drawing for a moment, thoughtful. "I don't really know," she admitted. "It's been cold since then, very cold." "A few weeks, maybe," Victor suggested. "I think so," she agreed, returning to her drawing. "I counted a lot of days." Victor tried to imagine the scale of time for a 5-year-old alone on the streets. Each day must have felt like an eternity, and there was no one else, no relatives, no friends who could take care of you. Sophie shook her head. "Just me and Daddy. It was always just the two of us." The loneliness of that statement hung in the air between them. Somehow, it seemed that fate had brought two equally lonely people together that Christmas night. "Well," Victor said finally, "you're not alone anymore, Sophie." She looked up from her drawing and stared at him for a long moment, as if trying to determine if she could really believe it. "Promise?" she asked, her small voice carrying the weight of the mistrust that life had already taught her. Victor knew he shouldn't make promises he might not be able to keep. He knew Sophie's future was not in his hands, that there would be procedures, authorities, decisions that were beyond his control. But looking at that child, at those eyes that had already seen too much abandonment, he couldn't stop himself. "I promise," he said firmly. "You are not alone anymore, Sophie." And as he said it, he felt he was also making a promise to himself that no matter what happened, he would not let that child go back to the streets, to the cold, to the fear of not waking up the next morning. Somehow they had found each other that Christmas night. And maybe, just maybe, it hadn't been a coincidence at all. 3 days had passed since Sophie entered Victor's life. 3 days that completely transformed his apartment, and without him realizing it at first, his own existence. On the morning of the 4th day, Victor woke to the sound of laughter coming from the living room. He lay there for a moment, just listening. It was a sound his apartment had not known for a very long time. He got up and, still in his pajamas, walked silently to the bedroom door. Sophie was sitting on the living room rug, surrounded by colorful drawings, chatting animatedly with her rag doll. She had dressed the doll in a small scarf that Victor didn't even remember owning. "And so, Lily," she was saying seriously, "we have to fix your hair for tea. Mr. Bear will be there, and you know how elegant he is." Victor smiled, leaning against the doorframe. Mr. Bear was a worn-out stuffed animal he had found in the back of the closet, a gift he had bought for Claire and never had the chance to give. In the last few days, he and Sophie had established a routine. In the morning, they had breakfast together. Then, while Victor worked on his computer in his small makeshift office, Sophie would draw or play quietly in the living room. They had lunch, and in the afternoon they would watch a movie or Victor would read her stories. The night before, they had made cookies together, filling the kitchen with flour and laughter. It was simple. It was ordinary. It was wonderful. "Good morning," he said finally, entering the room. Sophie looked up, her face lighting up with a smile. It was no longer the shy smile from the first day, but something more open, more confident. "Victor, Lily and I are getting ready for tea. Are you coming too?" "I wouldn't miss it for the world," he replied, sitting on the sofa. "Damn, what time is this important event?" "After lunch," she informed him seriously. "Mr. Bear is very punctual." Victor laughed. "Well, then we have time for breakfast first. How about waffles today?" "With chocolate syrup?" Maybe strawberries. We need to balance the sugar." Sophie made an exaggerated face that made him laugh again. It was amazing how, in just a few days, she had started to show more and more of her personality. The scared little girl from the park bench was still there, but now other facets were emerging. Curious, smart, sometimes stubborn, and with a sense of humor that surprised him. In the kitchen, as they prepared breakfast together, Victor watched how Sophie moved around the space with familiarity, as if she had always been there. She knew exactly where the bowls were, which drawer held the silverware, how to turn on the microwave. His apartment, once so sterile and silent, now seemed to vibrate with life. Sophie's drawings were everywhere, stuck to the refrigerator, on the coffee table. Even a portrait of him she had made was now framed next to Claire's photo. After breakfast, Victor washed the dishes while Sophie dried, a task she had insisted on taking over, climbing on a stool to reach the sink. "Ta Victor," she called as she carefully put away the plates. "Do you think the park still has snow today?" The day before, they had gone to the nearby park. Sophie had made her first snowman, and they had come home with red noses and frozen smiles on their faces. "Probably," he replied. "Why? Want to go again?" "Yes," she exclaimed, almost dropping a plate with her enthusiasm. "Can we make an even bigger snowman and bring a carrot for the nose this time?" Victor smiled, drying his hands on a dish towel. "We can. But first I have to finish some work." After lunch, we'll go to the park and then come back for the famous tea with Mr. Bear and Lily." "How does that sound?" Sophie agreed excitedly, jumping off the stool. "I'm going to draw the snowman we're going to make." As she ran to the living room, Victor felt that now familiar mix of joy and apprehension. Every day with Sophie was easier, more natural, more right, and that scared him deeply. He still hadn't called social services. He knew he should, that it was his obligation as a responsible adult, but every time he picked up the phone, something stopped him. He told himself it was better to wait for the Christmas holiday to pass, that he didn't want to interrupt the public servant's rest. But deep down, he knew he was just postponing the inevitable. In his office, he tried to focus on work. As a freelance graphic designer, he had deadlines to meet, clients waiting. But his mind kept drifting to the living room, where he could hear Sophie humming softly as she drew. How was it possible that just 4 days ago he was alone in this same apartment, feeling empty and abandoned? Now the place was full of life, colors, sounds. Sophie's small presence had filled every corner with an energy he didn't know was missing. The doorbell rang, interrupting his thoughts. Victor froze. He wasn't expecting anyone. He got up quickly and went to the living room, where Sophie was staring at the door with wide eyes. "It's just the doorman," he explained quickly, noticing her fear. "Stay here, I'll see what it is." It was indeed the doorman, delivering a package, the children's books Victor had ordered online the day before, an impulse buy after Sophie mentioned her father used to tell her stories to help her sleep. When he returned to the living room, Sophie had relaxed again, back to her drawings. Victor placed the package on the table. "I have a surprise for you," he announced. Her eyes lit up. "What is it?" Victor opened the package, revealing 5 colorful children's books. "I thought you might like some new stories." Sophie approached slowly, touching the shiny covers with reverence. "Are they all for me?" "All for you," he confirmed. She picked up one of the books, a story about a girl who befriends a bear in the forest, and hugged it to her chest. "No one has ever given me so many things," she said softly. Victor felt a pang in his heart. He knelt down to her level. "They're just books, Sophie. It's no big deal." She shook her head, disagreeing. "Yes, it is. It's a lot." And then, without warning, she stepped forward and hugged him. It was quick and awkward, but a real hug. The first one she had initiated. Victor was paralyzed for a second, surprised, before gently hugging her back. Sophie pulled away almost immediately, turning her attention back to the books. But the moment hung in the air between them, a small bridge built, a small wall torn down. In the afternoon, as promised, they went to the park. The snowman they built was indeed bigger than the one from the day before, with a carrot for a nose and real buttons for eyes. Sophie ran through the snow, throwing snowballs at Victor, who pretended to be defeated in battle, falling dramatically to the ground as she laughed. Back in the apartment, soaked and smiling, Victor prepared hot chocolate while Sophie set the living room table for tea. Lily the doll and Mr. Bear occupied places of honor, with small, improvised napkins in front of them. Victor watched the scene, the arranged toys, the colorful drawings on the walls, the children's books stacked next to the sofa, and felt something tighten in his chest. His apartment, once a space he merely occupied, now felt like a home. A real home, with memories being built in every corner. But for how long? The question crept into his mind, bringing a wave of anxiety with it. None of this was permanent. Sophie wasn't his daughter. At some point, he would have to hand her over to the authorities. It was the right thing to do. It was the legal thing to do. The thought of returning to his previous loneliness, of seeing the drawings taken down from the walls, of no longer hearing that laughter in the house, was almost unbearable. In just a few days, this little girl had become essential to his life, filling voids he didn't even know existed. "Victor, tea is served." Sophie's voice brought him back to the present. She was sitting at the table, pouring imaginary tea into real cups, with an expression of absolute seriousness. Victor took a deep breath, pushing away the dark thoughts. For now, Sophie was here. For now, there was laughter and drawings and snowmen. For now, his home was alive again, and maybe, just maybe, he could find a way to make this happiness last. "I'm coming," he replied, bringing the mugs of hot chocolate to the table. We can't keep Mr. Bear waiting. He's very punctual after all. The smile Sophie gave him in return lit up the entire apartment, chasing away the shadows. At least for now. The phone rang on a Wednesday morning, 2 weeks after Christmas. Victor answered distractedly, his eyes still fixed on the computer screen where he was finalizing a project. Hello? Victor, it's Amanda. He sat up straight in his chair, surprised to hear his ex-wife's voice. They rarely spoke directly, usually exchanging short messages about schedules and arrangements related to Claire. Amanda, hello. Is something wrong? Not exactly, she replied, her tone as professional as ever. I have to travel for work next week. A conference in Chicago. I can't miss it. Victor waited, already guessing where this conversation was heading. I know it's not your weekend, she continued, but would it be possible for Claire to stay with you? It would be for a whole week. A whole week. Victor felt his heart race. He hadn't had Claire for that long since the divorce, 3 years ago. Of course, he replied immediately. Of course she can stay. Great. I catch my flight on Monday morning, so could I drop her off with you on Sunday afternoon around 4? Perfect. I'll be waiting. There was a pause on the line. She's excited to go, Amanda said, her tone softening a bit. She mentioned that board game you two played last time. Victor smiled. I'll have it ready. After settling the details, he hung up the phone with a mix of excitement and nervousness. Claire, his daughter, was coming to spend a whole week. It was then that reality hit him. Sophie. He looked into the living room where the girl was sitting on the rug, focused on her latest drawing. For the past 2 weeks, Sophie had become part of his daily routine, a constant and comforting presence. His apartment was now filled with colorful drawings, small toys, and childish laughter. And he still hadn't told anyone about her. It wasn't for lack of opportunity. He could have called social services at any time. He could have explained the situation, filled out reports, started the official process. But with each passing day, the idea of handing Sophie over to strangers became harder to consider. Now, with Claire's impending visit, the situation was even more complicated. How would he explain Sophie's presence to his daughter, to his ex-wife? What would Amanda think when she found out he was sheltering a child without any official documentation? Sophie, he called, walking into the living room. She looked up from her drawing, smiling. Yes. Victor sat on the sofa, thinking about the best way to explain. Remember I told you about my daughter, Claire? Sophie nodded. Victor had shown her all the pictures of Claire, told her stories about her. Sophie seemed fascinated by the idea of meeting the girl who smiled in the photographs. She's coming to spend a week here with us. She arrives on Sunday. Sophie's eyes lit up. Really? Can we play together? Will she like my drawings? Her excitement was contagious, but Victor felt a pang of worry. I'm sure she will, he replied, trying to sound confident. But, Sophie, I need to tell you something. Claire, she doesn't know about you yet. It's going to be a surprise for her. Sophie frowned, processing the information. Will she be mad? The question caught Victor off guard. He hadn't considered that possibility. But now that Sophie mentioned it, it seemed obvious. Claire had always been a possessive child when it came to him, especially after the divorce. How would she react to finding another girl in her space? No, of course not, he assured, more to himself than to Sophie. She might be a little surprised at first, but I'm sure you two will get along. You're the same age. You'll have a lot in common. Sophie didn't seem entirely convinced, but she returned to her drawing. Victor noticed that she was now drawing 2 girls holding hands, one blonde and one brunette. The following days were filled with preparation. Victor tidied up the guest room for Claire, making sure everything was just how she liked it. Sophie helped make chocolate chip cookies, Claire's favorite, and insisted on making a welcome card. On Sunday, Victor's anxiety was at its peak. He checked the apartment several times, making sure everything was perfect. Sophie seemed to have caught his nervousness, changing her outfit 3 times and repeatedly asking if her hair looked nice. At 4 o'clock sharp, the doorbell rang. They're here, Victor announced, feeling his heart race. So are you ready? Sophie nodded, though she suddenly seemed shy, partially hiding behind him as they walked to the door. Victor took a deep breath and opened it. Claire was there, a pink backpack on her shoulders, her brown hair in an elaborate braid. Beside her, Amanda, elegant as always in her expensive coat, held a small suitcase. "Daddy!" Claire exclaimed, launching herself into a hug. Victor scooped her up into his arms, feeling that familiar wave of love and longing, her scent of children's shampoo, the warmth of her small body, the way she fit perfectly in his embrace. It all made him realize how much he had missed her. "Hey, princess," he said, kissing the top of her head. "I missed you so much." It was then that Claire, still in his arms, spotted Sophie standing a few steps behind. Her eyes widened, and she pulled back slightly from the hug. "Who is she?" she asked, her voice suddenly and noticeably restrained. Victor put Claire down and turned to Amanda, who had also noticed Sophie, and was watching him with an expression that mixed confusion and something that looked like disapproval. "This is Sophie," he introduced, gesturing for the girl to come closer. "Sophie, this is my daughter Claire, and this is Amanda, Claire's mum." Sophie took a step forward, holding the card she had made. "Hi," she said shyly. "I made a card for you." Claire looked at the colourful card, then at her father, then back at Sophie, without making any move to take the gift. "What is this girl doing here?" she finally asked, her tone restrained but clearly annoyed. Victor felt the atmosphere instantly tense up. Amanda was staring at him with an expression that demanded an explanation. "Sophie is staying with me for a while," he replied, trying to keep his voice casual. "She needed some help." "Staying with you," Amanda repeated, finally breaking her silence. "Victor, can we talk for a minute? In private?" He nodded, suddenly feeling like a teenager caught doing something wrong. "Claire, why don't you and Sophie go to the living room? There are cookies in the kitchen, you can get some." Claire didn't move, looking at Sophie as if she were an intruder in her territory. "Come on, Claire," Amanda insisted gently. "Daddy and I need to talk." Reluctantly, Claire walked into the apartment, passing Sophie without looking at her. Sophie, still holding the card, followed her hesitantly. Victor closed the door and faced Amanda, bracing himself for the interrogation. "Who is she?" Amanda asked bluntly. "And please don't tell me you've adopted a child without consulting me." "It's nothing like that," Victor hurried to say. "It's complicated." He briefly explained how he had found Sophie on Christmas Eve, her situation of abandonment, the decision to temporarily shelter her. Amanda listened to him with an increasingly incredulous expression. "Victor, this is insane. You can't just pick a child off the street and decide to keep her. There are procedures, laws. You should have called social services immediately." "I know," he admitted, "but it was Christmas and she was so scared. Then it just happened so naturally. She adjusted so well." "Naturally?" Amanda shook her head. "None of this is natural. You have no idea about this child's history, who her parents were if anyone is looking for her." "Her father died," Victor defended himself. "She was alone." "And you took the word of a 5-year-old child," Amanda sighed, running a hand through her perfectly styled hair. "Look, I'm not going to argue about this now. I have a plane to catch tomorrow. But when I get back, we're going to have a serious talk about this, and you should call the authorities as soon as possible." Victor knew she was right, but something inside him rebelled against the idea. "She'll be fine here. She's not bothering anyone." Amanda glanced into the apartment, where they could see the two girls in the living room, clearly uncomfortable, sitting as far apart from each other as possible. "Are you sure about that? It looks like Claire isn't too happy with the arrangement." Victor followed her gaze, feeling a pang of concern. "It's just surprise. They'll get used to each other." Amanda didn't seem convinced, but she checked her watch and sighed. "I have to go. Claire's documents are in the suitcase, along with her allergy medication and the list of emergency contacts." "I know how to take care of my daughter, Amanda," Victor said, a touch of irritation in his voice. "I know you do," she replied, softening her tone, "but now you have 2 children to care for, and one of them is practically a stranger." She approached the living room door. "Claire, come say goodbye." Claire ran to her mother, hugging her tightly. "Are you sure you have to go, Mommy?" Amanda knelt, fixing her daughter's bangs. "I do, sweetie. But it will be fun to stay with Daddy. And when I get back, maybe we can take that trip to the zoo you wanted." Claire nodded but didn't seem enthusiastic. Amanda kissed her forehead, then stood up and looked meaningfully at Victor. 1 week. Take good care of her. I always do, he replied. After Amanda left, a strange silence fell over the apartment. Claire remained near the door, looking at Victor as if expecting an explanation. Sophie stood in the middle of the living room, still holding the card, looking smaller and more vulnerable than ever. Well, Victor said, trying to sound cheerful, how about that game we played last time, Claire? I set up the board yesterday. Who is she? Claire repeated, ignoring the suggestion. Why is she here? Victor approached, kneeling to his daughter's level. Sophie is staying with me for a while because she needed help. She doesn't have a family right now, and I'm taking care of her. Claire frowned, like she's your daughter. The question caught Victor off guard. That was exactly what had been happening, he realized. For the past 2 weeks, he had been caring for Sophie as if she were his daughter. Not exactly, he answered carefully. I'm just helping, like when we help people who are in need. Claire looked at Sophie, who remained motionless in the middle of the room. Taya, but this is my place, Claire said, quiet enough for only Victor to hear. You're my dad. Victor's heart ached. Claire, I am your dad, and I always will be. Nothing will ever change that. Ever. Sophie being here doesn't change how much I love you at all. Claire didn't answer, just stared at him for a long moment before picking up her backpack from the floor. I want to go to my room, she announced. But Claire, you just got here. I thought we could play a game or watch a movie, all together. I'm tired, she insisted. I want to be alone for a bit. Victor sighed, recognizing the stubbornness on his daughter's face. It was a battle he wouldn't win right now. All right, the room is ready for you. Rest for a bit and we'll talk later, okay? Claire nodded and walked towards the hallway, passing Sophie without a glance. When the bedroom door closed, Victor turned to Sophie, who was still standing in the same spot, the colorful card crumpled in her small hands. She didn't like me, Sophie said softly. Victor approached her, crouching down. That's not it, Sophie. Claire is just surprised. She didn't know about you. And sometimes it takes kids a little while to get used to changes. Just give her some time. Sophie nodded, but her sad eyes said she didn't quite believe his words. Can I go to my room too? Victor's heart tightened. Of course you can, but don't you want a cookie first? You helped make them. She shook her head. I'm not hungry. When Sophie had also retreated, Victor found himself alone in the living room, surrounded by the sudden silence that had taken over the apartment. Just 15 minutes ago, he had been anxious and happy at the prospect of having Claire home for a whole week. Now he felt torn between the two girls, each shut away in her own room, separated by a hallway and something much harder to cross. For the rest of the day, the mood remained tense. Claire only came out of her room for dinner, sitting silently at the table, answering Victor's questions with monosyllables. Sophie, for her part, seemed to have reverted to the shyness of the first few days, speaking little and keeping her eyes downcast. Victor tried to start conversations, suggest activities they could do together, but every attempt was met with resistance. The one time Sophie tried to approach, offering to show Claire her drawings, she was met with such a cold "I don't want to see" that it made her retreat immediately. When bedtime arrived, Victor tucked each of them into their rooms, reading separate stories, giving separate goodnight kisses. The house that had been filled with life and laughter in recent weeks now seemed divided by an invisible and seemingly insurmountable barrier. Sitting alone in the living room after the girls had fallen asleep, Victor stared at the photographs on the bookshelf, Claire smiling on her birthday, Sophie drawing captured by him just a few days ago. Two children who meant everything to him, now under the same roof, yet so far apart. For the first time since he found Sophie that Christmas Eve, Victor wondered if he had made a mistake, if maybe Amanda was right, and he should have contacted the authorities immediately. If Sophie's presence could cost him his already fragile relationship with Claire. The fear of losing his daughter, of seeing resentment grow in her eyes, was almost paralyzing. Claire had already lost so much with the divorce, an intact family, the daily presence of her father. Was it fair to ask her to share the little she had with a stranger? On the other hand, how could he turn his back on Sophie now? How could he explain to her that there was no longer a place for her in his life, in his home? Victor ran a hand over his face, exhausted. The week he had awaited with such anticipation now stretched before him like an emotional minefield. Somehow, he had to find a path between the two little hearts that now depended on him, a path that wouldn't break either of them. But on that first night, as the heavy silence filled the apartment, the solution seemed as distant as the stars Sophie used to watch when she was alone on the streets. The third night of Claire's stay at Victor's house was marked by another silent dinner. His attempts to start conversations died after a few words, and the only constant sound was that of silverware against plates. Claire kept her eyes fixed on her food, while Sophie occasionally glanced at the other girl, always met with indifference. After dinner, Victor suggested they watch a movie together, but Claire said she'd rather read in her room. Sophie, in turn, asked to draw at the living room table. The apartment that had filled with life in the preceding weeks now seemed divided into demarcated territories, with invisible borders that no one dared to cross. At bedtime, Victor went into Sophie's room for their usual reading routine. She was sitting on the bed, hugging her rag doll, her gaze distant. "What story do you want to hear today?" he asked, showing her the books they had bought together. Sophie shook her head. "None, thank you." Victor sat on the edge of the bed, worried by this unusual response. Sophie loved story time. "Is everything okay, Sophie?" She nodded, but her eyes told a different story. You know," Victor began carefully, "sometimes it takes time for people to get to know each other. Claire just needs to get used to the idea of sharing her dad." Sophie looked at him, her blue eyes too serious for a 5-year-old. "She doesn't like me," she said simply, "and I'm getting in your way." "You're not getting in the way of anything," Victor assured her, placing a hand on hers. "Claire is just adjusting. She's not used to sharing this space. Like when Daddy and I had to share our spot on the street with other people," Sophie said thoughtfully. "Sometimes it was hard." Victor's heart ached. The comparison, made with such innocence, revealed a deep understanding of the situation. "It's a little different," he said gently. "But yes, changes can be hard." Sophie was silent for a moment, stroking the patchy hair of her doll. "Victor," she began hesitantly, "what's going to happen to me when Claire leaves?" The question caught him off guard. It was something he had been constantly thinking about, without reaching a conclusion. "Well, we'll go on as before," he replied, trying to sound confident. "We'll make cookies, draw, read stories. And when her mom comes back, she didn't like me either." Victor sighed. It was true that Amanda had shown concern, even disapproval, about Sophie's presence. She had promised to revisit the subject when she returned, likely insisting that he contact the authorities. "Don't worry about that now," he said, trying to push away his own concerns. "We'll take it one step at a time, okay?" Sophie nodded, but she didn't look convinced. Victor kissed her forehead and tucked the blanket around her. "Good night, Sophie. Tomorrow will be a better day, you'll see." "Good night, Victor," she replied, closing her eyes. He left the room feeling the weight of the situation on his shoulders. After checking that Claire was already asleep, he went to his own room, physically and emotionally exhausted. His sleep was restless, full of confusing dreams where he ran through snow-covered streets, searching for something he couldn't find. Sometime in the early morning, he woke with a start, with the uneasy feeling that something was wrong. He looked at the clock, 5:17 am. The house was silent, as one would expect at that hour. Still, he got up to check on the girls. First, he went to Claire's room. He opened the door slowly and saw his daughter sleeping peacefully, her brown hair spread over the pillow. He closed the door carefully and went to the room next door. Sophie's bedroom door was ajar. Victor pushed it open slowly, expecting to find the girl asleep like Claire. The bed was empty. For a moment, he thought she might have gone to the bathroom, or perhaps to the kitchen for a drink of water. But something about the perfectly made bed made his heart race. "Sophie," he called softly, entering the room. It was then he noticed the small backpack they had bought together, where she kept her treasures, her favorite drawings, the colored pencils, a few small toys, was not in its usual place. The rag doll, Lily, which never left her side, was also gone. And on the pillow, a folded piece of paper. Victor picked it up with trembling fingers and opened it. There, in large, clumsy letters, written in blue-colored pencil, was a simple message. "Thank you for everything. I will never forget." The world seemed to stop for a second. Sophie was gone. The girl he had found alone on a Christmas night, who had filled his home with life and color, who had become so important in such a short time, had disappeared back into the night. "No, no, no," Victor murmured, running to the living room. He frantically searched for any sign of Sophie, but only found more absence. Her coat wasn't on the rack. The little shoes they bought together weren't in the entryway. The front door was unlocked. She must have turned the handle very carefully so as not to make a sound. Victor rushed back to Claire's room and turned on the light. "Claire," he called, shaking her gently. "Claire, wake up." She opened her eyes, confused by the abrupt awakening. "Dad, what's wrong?" "Sophie's gone," he said, his voice tense with worry. "She's run away." Claire sat up in bed, rubbing her eyes. "Run away? Where to?" "I don't know," he replied, already grabbing a coat from her closet. "But we have to find her. It's cold outside, and she's just a little kid. Get dressed, quickly." To his surprise, Claire didn't protest. She got up immediately and started putting on warm clothes over her pajamas. In a few minutes, they were both ready to leave. In the elevator, Victor tried to think where Sophie might have gone. The city was big and dangerous for a 5-year-old alone, especially in the dark. "Where do you think she went?" Claire asked as they ran through the lobby. "I don't know for sure," Victor replied, stopping to ask the doorman if he had seen a little girl leave. The negative response only increased his worry. "Maybe she went back to where I found her, or to the church she mentioned once." They went out into the street, greeted by the biting early morning air. The sky was still dark, with only a faint hint of light on the horizon. The streets were practically deserted. "This way," Victor said, pulling Claire by the hand. "Let's check the square first." They walked hurriedly along the sidewalks covered in a thin layer of snow, their rushed footsteps echoing in the silence. Victor kept his eyes peeled, scanning every alley, every dark corner, fearing what he might find, or not find. "Why did she run away?" Claire finally asked, breaking the silence between them. Victor hesitated. The question was simple, but the answer was too complex to explain at that moment. "I think she felt unwanted," he answered at last. Claire was silent for a few moments, only the sound of their quick footsteps filling the air. "Because of me?" she then asked, her voice small. Victor looked at his daughter, surprised by her perception. "It wasn't your fault, Claire. It's a complicated situation for everyone." They arrived at the square where it had all begun. Victor ran to the bench where he had found Sophie that Christmas night, but it was empty. Disappointment tightened his chest. "She's not here," he murmured. "Where do we go now?" asked Claire, her breath forming small white clouds in the cold air. Victor tried to think. Sophie had mentioned a church a few times, a place where she sometimes got food and shelter. "Let's try the church," he decided. "It's a few blocks from here." They resumed their walk, now heading towards the city center. The dawn light was beginning to tinge the sky a pale blue, making the search a little easier. Victor called out Sophie's name from time to time, his voice echoing in the empty streets. "Dad?" Claire said after a few blocks, her voice hesitant. "Can I ask you something?" "Of course," he replied, still scanning every corner with his eyes. Do you like Sophie more than me now?" Victor stopped abruptly, turning to face his daughter. Her eyes, so much like his car, were full of insecurity. "Claire," he said, kneeling to her level, "how could you think that?" She shrugged, avoiding his gaze. "You seem so happy with her. You have her drawings all over the house. You have inside jokes I don't get, and you—" She hesitated. "You seem different. Happier than when you're with me." Her words hit him like a punch. Had it been that obvious? Had his joy in Sophie's presence made Claire feel less loved? "I just thought you didn't need me anymore," she continued, her voice almost a whisper. Victor took her hands, feeling how cold they were. "Claire, look at me," he asked softly. When she lifted her eyes, he continued, "You will never be replaced, never. You will always be my daughter, and I love you more than anything in the world." Her eyes shimmered with unshed tears. "I just found Sophie alone in the cold, with no one," he explained. "I couldn't ignore her. I couldn't leave her there, knowing she had nowhere to go." Claire lowered her head, moved. "I know it's hard to understand," Victor continued, "but my heart is big enough to love you both, and you will always, always have a special place that no one could ever fill." She nodded slowly, then lifted her face again. "We need to find her," she said with a new determination in her voice. "It's too cold." Victor smiled, proud of the maturity he saw emerging in his daughter. He stood up, and together they continued the search. The church finally appeared ahead, an old stone building with a steeple that stood out against the brightening sky. The main gate was closed, but there was a small side garden with benches, and there, sitting on one of those benches, was Sophie, hugging her rag doll, her small backpack beside her, her face red from the cold. "There!" exclaimed Claire, pointing. Victor felt a relief so immense it almost left him breathless. They ran towards the garden. "Sophie!" he called out. The girl raised her head, startled. For a moment, Victor feared she might try to run again, but she remained seated, watching them approach with wide eyes. "Victor?" she said, sounding surprised and confused. "Claire?" Victor knelt before her, ignoring the snow that soaked his pants. "You had us very worried," he said, his voice a mixture of relief and tenderness. "Why did you run away like that?" Sophie looked down, clutching the doll to her chest. "I was in the way," she murmured. "You two need to be together, just the two of you." "That's not true," Victor replied firmly. "You weren't in the way at all." "But Claire doesn't like me," Sophie insisted, glancing quickly at the other girl. "And I get it. He's her dad." Victor looked at Claire, who stood beside him, watching the scene with a hard-to-read expression. "Sophie," he said, turning back to the girl before him, "you don't have to run away. I promise you'll never be alone again." To his surprise, Claire took a step forward and knelt beside him at Sophie's level. "Thomas, I'm sorry," she said, her voice small but sincere. "I was mean to you. I didn't want you to actually leave." Sophie looked up, clearly surprised by Claire's words. "It wasn't your fault," she replied. "I understand. He's your dad." "He can be a dad to both of us," Claire said, looking at Victor for a moment, as if seeking confirmation. "I have my mom, too." You don't have anyone anymore." Sophie nodded slowly, still clutching her doll. "Can we try to be friends?" Claire suggested, holding out her hand tentatively. Sophie looked at the outstretched hand, then at Claire's face, as if searching for signs that this might be a trap. Then, slowly, her eyes filled with hope. "I'd like that very much," she replied, taking Claire's hand. Victor watched the moment with a full heart. It was a small miracle before his eyes, the beginning of something he had feared was impossible. "Let's go home," he said, standing up and extending his hands to the two girls. "It's cold out here." Claire and Sophie stood up, each holding one of his hands. Victor helped Sophie put her backpack on, and together they started walking back to the apartment. "Can we have hot chocolate when we get there?" Sophie asked shyly. "With whipped cream," Claire added. "Dad makes the best hot chocolate with whipped cream." "And cinnamon," Sophie completed. "Cinnamon?" Claire made a face. "I've never tried it with cinnamon." "It's really good," Sophie assured her. "I can show you." Victor walked between them, listening to the start of a real conversation between them for the first time. It was hesitant, cautious, but it was a beginning. A small step on a journey that he knew would not be easy. But as they headed home under the soft light of dawn, the two girls holding his hands, Victor felt a certainty grow in his heart. Somehow, they would find a way together. Somehow, this strange, improvised family that fate had brought together would find its own way to fit. The rising sun painted the sky in pink and gold, promising a new day. And maybe, Victor thought, a new beginning for all of them as well. The days following Sophie's escape brought a surprising transformation. The apartment, once divided by uncomfortable silences, now echoed with childish laughter. It was as if the ice had completely melted. Claire, after that early morning when she helped search for Sophie, seemed to have changed. The realization that the other girl could actually disappear had awakened something in her, a greater understanding of what it meant to share, of what it meant to have someone truly in need of her father. "Can I see your drawings?" Claire asked the next morning, sitting next to Sophie on the living room rug. Shyly, Sophie showed her creations. Claire examined each one with genuine attention. "They're beautiful. You draw so much better than I do." Sophie's face lit up at the compliment. "I can teach you if you want." It was the beginning of a true friendship. The activities they once did separately, they now did together. Drawing, watching movies snuggled on the couch, building forts with sheets and pillows. Victor watched this transformation in awe. Soon the girls were inseparable. Claire had even insisted that Sophie sleep on a mattress next to her bed, like a sleepover that never ends. At night, Victor could hear them whispering and giggling long after bedtime. "Don't you think I can come visit you after I leave?" Claire asked one night, her voice floating down the hallway to where Victor was making tea in the kitchen. "You'll want to." Sophie's voice sounded surprised. "Of course, you're my friend now." Victor smiled, feeling a huge weight lifted from his shoulders. What had seemed impossible a few days ago was happening naturally. His daughter and Sophie were forming a genuine bond. Meanwhile, he finally gathered the courage to call social services. The conversation was long, with explanations about how he found Sophie and why he took so long to report the case. The social worker on the other end of the line was surprisingly understanding, but made it clear that the process would not be simple. Home visits, background checks, psychological evaluation, all of that will be necessary, she explained. And we will need to find or issue documents for the child. Are you sure you want to go down this path, sir? Absolutely, Victor replied without hesitation. The last day of Claire's visit arrived faster than anyone wished. Amanda would be returning from her trip in the afternoon, and a bittersweet atmosphere hung over the apartment. The girls savored every minute as if it were their last, which, in a way, it was. Together, they had built an elaborate fort in the living room, decorated with Sophie's drawings and lit by a small lantern. From inside, Victor could hear whispers and laughter, plans for future games, and promises not to forget each other. "You're going to keep living with my dad, right?" Claire's voice asked. There was a short pause before Sophie replied, "I hope so. He likes you a lot. You can tell by the way he smiles when you're around." Victor felt something tighten in his chest upon hearing that. It was true. Sophie had brought back a joy he hadn't felt in a long time. The doorbell rang promptly at 3 in the afternoon. Amanda was as elegant as ever in her travel suit, her hair perfectly coiffed despite the flight. "How was the conference?" Victor asked, trying to keep the conversation casual. "Productive," she answered briefly. Lowering her voice, she added, "And how were things here? With the situation?" Before Victor could answer, laughter came from the living room. Amanda raised her eyebrows in surprise and walked in that direction. What she found was clearly not what she expected. Claire and Sophie were sitting side by side on the rug, drawing together on a large sheet of paper, completely absorbed in their task. "Mommy!" Claire exclaimed upon noticing her mother's presence. She stood up and ran to hug her. Amanda hugged her back, but her eyes were fixed on Sophie, who was now standing up shyly. "Hello," the girl said politely. "I'm Sophie." "I know who you are," Amanda replied, her tone cautious but not hostile. She turned to Claire. "Did you have fun with Daddy?" "It was the best weekend ever," Claire smiled broadly. "Sophie and I did so many things together." "Want to see our fort?" Amanda cast a surprised glance at Victor before being dragged by her daughter to see the sheet fort in the corner of the room. "Did you two build this yourselves?" she asked, clearly impressed. "Sophie had the idea for the lights. She's very creative." Victor watched as Amanda processed this information. It was clear she had expected to find a resentful Claire, not an excited child talking about her new friend. "Your drawings are very beautiful," Amanda said finally, addressing Sophie. "Thank you," the girl replied with a small smile. "Claire taught me how to draw flowers, and Sophie taught me how to draw people better," Claire added, showing a drawing with 4 figures. "Look, Mommy, it's our family. Me, you, Daddy, and Sophie." A momentary silence hung between the adults. Victor and Amanda exchanged significant glances, a silent conversation passing between them. "So it's very nice," Amanda said at last, "but we need to go. You have school tomorrow." Claire's face fell. "Already?" "Yes, sweetie. Go get your things." While Claire went to get her backpack, Amanda approached Victor. "Have you spoken to social services?" she asked in a low voice. "Yeah," he confirmed. "The first visit is scheduled for next week." Amanda nodded, looking relieved. "And what do you plan to do?" Victor took a deep breath. "I want to adopt her, Amanda." She didn't seem surprised. "I figured as much." After a pause, she added, "Claire seems attached to her." They got along well in the end. Amanda studied his face for a moment. "I've never seen you like this, you know. Not even when Claire was born. There's something different about you." Victor didn't know how to respond. It was true. Something had changed in him since he met Sophie. In the living room, the girls were hugging in an emotional farewell. Claire wrapped her arms tightly around Sophie, as if she didn't want to let go. "I really liked meeting you," Claire said, pulling back to look into Sophie's eyes. "Next time, can we play more?" Sophie smiled, visibly moved. "I really liked it too. And yes, we can play as much as you want. Promise you'll take care of my dad. Sometimes he forgets to eat when he's working." Sophie nodded solemnly. "I promise." "Claire, we have to go," Amanda called from the door. The girls reluctantly separated. Claire picked up her backpack and went to Victor for a final hug. "Bye, Dad," she said, squeezing him tight. "I love you." "I love you too, Princess," he replied, kissing the top of her head. "More than anything." "More than Sophie?" she asked, not with jealousy, but with genuine curiosity. Victor smiled. "In different ways, but just as strong. Like having two favorite ice cream flavors at the same time." Claire seemed satisfied with the answer. "I think I get it." Amanda picked up Claire's suitcase and headed for the door. "I'll call to see how things are going," she said to Victor, with a look that communicated more than her words. They went down to the sidewalk together. Sophie stayed in the apartment, watching from the window. When they reached the car, Claire looked up and waved frantically. Sophie waved back, her small face visible behind the glass. "Bye, Sophie." "See you soon," Claire shouted from the car window as Amanda started the engine. As the car pulled away, Victor stood on the sidewalk for a moment, feeling the usual pang of sadness seeing his daughter leave. But this time, something was different. The promise of a "see you soon" felt more concrete, more certain. He went back up to the apartment, where he found Sophie still at the window, looking at the now empty street. "Is she coming back?" the girl asked, turning to him. "She is," Victor confirmed. "I'm sure of it." Sophie nodded, turning her attention back to the drawings scattered on the floor. She began to organize them carefully, separating the ones Claire had made into a special pile. Victor watched her for a moment, gathering courage for the conversation he had postponed. Finally, he approached and knelt to her level. "Sophie," he began, feeling his heart race, "can I ask you something important?" She stopped what she was doing and looked at him with her big blue eyes. "What?" "I talked to some people who help children like you find families. I explained how we met, how you've been staying here with me." Sophie became very still, her face suddenly apprehensive. "Are they going to take me away?" "No," Victor hurried to say. "Not if you don't want to go. In fact," he took a deep breath, finding the courage to ask the question that would change their lives forever. "Sophie, do you want me to be your real dad?" Her eyes widened, slowly understanding the meaning of his words. "You mean forever?" she whispered, as if afraid that speaking too loudly might break the spell. Victor nodded, smiling gently. "Forever, legally, officially. I would be your father, and you would be my daughter. This would be your home, permanently." Sophie's eyes filled with tears. For a terrible moment, Victor feared he had made a mistake, had presumed too much. But then, without warning, she threw herself into his arms, hugging him with all the strength her small body possessed. "Yes," she said between sobs, her tears wetting his shirt. "Yes, thank you so much." Victor hugged her back, feeling his own tears begin to fall. They stayed like that for a long time, a perfect moment of pure connection, of promise of a family being formed. In the weeks that followed, the adoption process was initiated. There were bureaucratic complications, of course, Sophie's lack of documentation, the unconventional circumstances of their meeting all created obstacles, but Victor was persistent. He met with lawyers, filled out forms, went through interviews and evaluations. The home visits from the social worker became frequent, and each time she seemed more impressed by the bond between Victor and Sophie. 2 months later, in a small courtroom, the judge finally banged the gavel. The adoption was officially completed. Sophie was now, in the eyes of the law, Sophie Caldwell, Victor's daughter. That night, when they returned home, Victor had a surprise for Sophie. For the past few weeks, while the adoption process was underway, he had been secretly working on renovating one of the rooms in the apartment. "I have something to show you," he said, leading her down the hall. He opened the door that was once his office. The space had been completely transformed. The walls, once white, were now a soft blue. There was a new bed with a star-patterned quilt, a small desk, and most especially, a custom-built shelf to display her drawings. "This is your room," Victor said. "All yours." Sophie walked in slowly, touching every surface as if in disbelief, as if the room might disappear at any moment. "It's so beautiful," she whispered. "Do you really like it?" he asked, anxious for her reaction. "It's perfect," she replied, turning to him with eyes shining with happiness. "That's the most beautiful room in the world." Victor smiled, feeling that now familiar wave of paternal love that Sophie awakened in him. "Welcome home, Sophie Caldwell," he said softly. She came over and took his hand, looking around the room at her place in the world. "I'm home," she repeated, as if testing the words, as if finally believing them. "I'm home." 6 months passed since Sophie officially became a Caldwell. The harsh winter had given way to spring, and now summer filled the days with light and warmth. Victor's apartment, once so quiet and empty, now pulsed with a peaceful, lively routine. In the mornings, Victor would make breakfast while Sophie set the table, a task she had claimed as her own. She folded the napkins carefully, placed the silverware in perfect order, displaying a surprising sense of organization for a 5-year-old. "Juice in the blue cup or the red one today?" she would ask seriously, as if it were a decision of the utmost importance. "Surprise me," Victor would reply, smiling as he watched the concentration on her face. Afternoons were filled with trips to the park, visits to the library, or simply hours of drawing at the living room table. Sophie had a natural talent for art, and Victor had framed several of her drawings, displaying them around the apartment. The house, which once reflected only his personality, now told both of their stories. On weekends, Claire often came to visit. The two girls had developed a true friendship, building forts around the house, inventing complex stories with their toys, and whispering secrets that Victor pretended he wasn't trying to overhear. Amanda, surprisingly, had become an ally. After the adoption was finalized, she gifted Sophie a set of professional colored pencils for the artist of the family. The simple gesture meant more than 1,000 words. On that summer afternoon, Victor was organizing some photographs. One in particular caught his eye, taken during Claire's last birthday. It showed him sitting on the sofa with the two girls, one on each side. All three faces were smiling at the camera, Claire making bunny ears behind Sophie's head, who was laughing carefree. It was the perfect image of a family, unconventional perhaps, but undeniably real. Victor got up and placed the framed photograph on the living room shelf, right next to the old photo of Claire. The two moments side by side told a story of transformation, of a void filled, of loneliness overcome. For a moment, he just looked at the images, remembering the lonely man he had been that Christmas Eve, the constant sense of loss that accompanied him, the emptiness that seemed impossible to fill. How could life change so much in such a short time? How could a chance meeting on a cold night completely rewrite his story? The sound of the phone interrupted his thoughts. Victor answered, immediately recognizing the excited voice on the other end. "Hi, Dad, it's Claire." "Hi, Princess," he replied, smiling as he heard his daughter. "Everything okay over there?" Everything's great. Mom is taking me to buy new school supplies. How's Sophie? Victor looked into the living room, where Sophie was lying on her stomach on the rug, surrounded by sheets of paper and colored pencils, completely absorbed in her latest drawing. She's good. She's drawing. What's she drawing now? Another family portrait. Victor smiled. Sophie's favorite theme was always the three of them, sometimes in a park, sometimes at home, sometimes in imaginary places. Each drawing was a new version of the same happy story. I'm not sure. It seems to be something with a lot of trees. Tell her I'm keeping all the drawings she gave me last visit. I miss her so much already. I can't wait to come back next weekend. I'll tell her she misses you too. Dad, Claire's voice suddenly turned serious. You're happy, aren't you, with Sophie and everything? The question, asked with the direct simplicity of a child, took Victor by surprise. He looked again at the girl focused on her drawing, at the rays of sun coming through the window and illuminating her blonde hair, at the house that was now full of life. Yes, Claire, I'm very happy. Good, she replied, sounding genuinely relieved. Mom says I have to go now. Love you, Dad. Love you too, Princess. See you on the weekend. When he hung up, Victor noticed that Sophie had gotten up and was now beside him, watching him curiously. Was that Claire? She asked. Yes, she says hi, and that she's keeping all your drawings. Sophie smiled, clearly pleased. Then her face took on a more serious, almost worried expression. Victor, she began, still hesitant to call him Dad, despite the adoption. Can I ask you something? Of course you can. Anything. She twisted the hem of her shirt between her fingers, a gesture Victor had come to associate with nervousness. Will I get to go to school? A real school, like Claire? The question caught him off guard. With everything that had happened, the adoption process, adjusting to a new life, building a routine, the issue of Sophie's formal education had taken a back seat. Victor knelt to her level, gently stroking her hair. Yes, you will. After the summer break, I'll enroll you in the same school as Claire, if you'd like. Sophie's face lit up instantly. Her eyes, so serious most of the time, filled with an almost palpable hope. I've always dreamed of going to school, she said softly, as if revealing a precious secret. Daddy used to say that one day, when we had a house, I would go to school. He said I would be very smart. Victor felt a lump in his throat. It was easy to forget everything Sophie had been through, how difficult life had been for her before. The little girl before him, who worried about setting the table perfectly and arranged her colored pencils by shade, had known a kind of suffering that children should never experience. You are already very smart, he assured her, holding her small hands in his. And you're going to love school. We'll buy your supplies, your backpack, everything you need. Can I have a lunchbox with stars on it? She asked, her voice full of hope. Of course you can, Victor laughed. The prettiest one we can find. Sophie smiled, that smile that had become more and more frequent in recent months, free from the fear and mistrust that once accompanied it. Thank you, she said simply, before returning to her drawing on the rug. Victor stood there for a moment, watching her. Then he walked to the shelf and looked again at the newly framed photograph. Him sitting between his two daughters, the unlikely family that fate had built. He took a deep breath, feeling a certainty settle in his chest, calm and solid as a rock. The emptiness that had followed him for so many years was finally gone. He wasn't alone anymore. He would never be alone again. The loneliness that had consumed him that Christmas Eve now seemed like a distant memory, almost belonging to someone else. In its place was this new life, full of colorful drawings, excited phone calls, plans for the future, and the sound of little footsteps around the house. Victor walked back to the living room and sat on the sofa, picking up one of the children's books that were now always nearby. Sophie looked up from her drawing and smiled at him. That smile that had changed everything. Yes, Victor thought, this was just the beginning. The beginning of something beautiful that would continue to grow and flourish in the years to come. And he couldn't wait to see what the future held for his family. He was not alone anymore. If this story touched your heart, subscribe to the channel and turn on notifications so you don't miss the next ones. Leave a like because it helps this story get recommended to more people. See you in the next story.